Most of the game companies we've looked at have similar traits. A lot of them are northern, for example. Mostly filled up with people who would rather not be on camera. That and the odd ones who welcome it, at least until everything suddenly goes tits up. Today though, we have a company that actually managed to carry it off a lot better than most. And they weren't northern. It's finally time to look at the Bitmap Brothers. Now we've actually covered a bunch of their games in the past already, but they are pretty damn good, so it's certainly worth playing them again. And the story behind them's something to boot. So without any further ado, let's go. The name Bitmap Brothers gives the impression of at least two people kicking everything off, like the Chemical Brothers, Dangerous Brothers, Hanson Brothers, that sort of thing. However, before there were any bitmaps, there was Mike Montgomery, a retail manager at Woolworths who got his start programming code on the ZX81 in 1980, later moving on to the Spectrum. For the first half of the decade, computing was a simple hobby, making disassemblers, hacking things here and there. However, he knew literally no one else who was doing the same thing. He didn't know how good he was, so as a way of measuring this, he went to interview for a job at Popular Computing Weekly in the mid-80s. He was told he could start on Monday, which kinda took him aback somewhat. After a quick period of negotiation and more formal goodbyes from Woolworths, a week later Mike Montgomery had found himself in the computer industry, almost by accident. Not bad for someone who, a few years prior, didn't even know what a computer was when confronted by the printouts that Woolies were using. The next step was meeting Steve Kelly, which happened in the mid-80s. Of all games, they worked together on a computer version of Scrabble. Kelly did the Specky version, and Montgomery did the C64 version. They soon did the same for versions of Monopoly and Cluedo, and that was when Eric Matthews came along for the ride. All the Bitmaps decided to get together from there, working on their first game, Zenon, a game originally made by Kelly for the Atari ST, and then ported to the Amiga by Montgomery. The formation of the Bitmap Brothers was something that quite naturally just ended up falling into place. Zenon would also end up providing the bitmaps with their initial big break. This top-down shooter, a fairly impressive one graphically that was quite well reviewed by magazines of the time, would end up being featured on the ITV children's show Get Fresh. Kids could call in and play the game over the phone, and if they were successful, they'd win a prize. Pretty much immediately, just after their very first game, the bitmaps had a strong reputation, and they would capitalise on it pretty fast. Being based in Wapping, at the time the UK's home of newspaper and print publication, the Bitmaps quickly decided that they needed to build an image that would make them stand out and wasn't just a group of faceless game developers. And so they decided to change that. The Bitmaps cultivated a cool image in the press. Sunglasses, suitable 80s hair, good fashion, denim and leather and all that good stuff. True rockstar developers. While this didn't necessarily translate to all-night cocaine binges and chucking Amigas out of windows or whatever, it meant that there was a hell of a lot more swagger about them. One of the most enduring images of the bitmaps out there is the classic shot of Montgomery, Kelly and Matthews standing on a roof in front of a helicopter. Which of course wasn't theirs. This was the roof of the Mirror building, and said chopper belonged to Mr. Black Magic himself, media tycoon and unholy tyrant Robert Maxwell. The Bitmaps waited all day on that roof for Maxwell to be flown back from the horse racing at Epsom to get 10 minutes with that chopper, but it was worth it. The Bitmaps were having their games published by Mirrorsoft at the time, and had it in their contract that the Bitmaps name should be pushed just as much as the games themselves were. This, just as much as the games, is one of the main reasons why the name of the Bitmap Brothers is so well known today, much more than a lot of other developers. They strove to push their name as much as they could, meaning lots of press for them, just as much as there was for the games. Mike Montgomery later on explained it concisely: you don't buy an Apple record, you buy a Beatles album. The approach of the Bitmaps was a response to the traditional ways of game marketing, wherein the publishers like Ocean and US Gold were the stars, and developers barely got any time. And needless to say, their approach was influential. It also extended to their games. There were always themes and motifs, little or small, that were the signatures of the Bitmaps and marked one of their games out as explicitly a Bitmap Brothers game. And as we go on to look at their games now, we'll see a bunch of them. Let's begin then with the Bitmaps from 1988 to around about 1990. To start with, we'll go right back to Zenon. The first Bitmaps game, originally released for the Atari ST in 1988, but shown here on the Amiga, resulted in a very quick breakthrough for them as mentioned. You play as a ship that can travel either in the air or on the ground, depending on the situation, You can usually switch between the two pretty easily, although some bosses force you to take one or the other. David Whittaker provides a high-octane soundtrack, and the game, well, it's just blasting fins pretty much. A kinda typical shooter, but it came at the right time when arcade-style games like this were becoming more commonplace on the Amiga. In fact, Zenon actually did receive a port to the arcades, although the machine itself ran on Amiga hardware called Arcadia. A very popular game at the time, Zenon got ports to plenty of other systems, including the C64 and Spectrum. Again, this is the only Bitmaps game to receive ports onto the 8-bit micros. Has it aged well? Well, not particularly. It's a very tricky shooter indeed, almost unfair right from the get-go, and the graphics and speed haven't aged particularly well. Still, you can see what made it such a popular game at the time. One other thing of note is the secret message hidden in the game's code, which makes the Bitmaps' feelings on software pirates pretty clear.
Pirates are the filth of the fucking world. 3 people have spent 7 months on this product, and scumbags rip it off in a couple of minutes. Yeah, very funny, ain't it?
And you can understand their frustrations. The beta for Xenon, then called Kelly X, was leaked onto the scene in 1987, months before the commercial release came out. Still, Xenon is also a landmark title in that it was the first Amiga game to appear in the UK overall top 40 for game sales. Ultimately, the game made a profit on its £25,000 advance, a figure that seems remarkable in this day and age. Zenon was published by Melbourne House, but the Bitmaps soon signed a contract with Mirrorsoft to publish games on their Imageworks label. They followed Zenon up with the original Speedball in the same year, 1988. Now, the story behind the game is quite fun. Originally, the Bitmaps were commissioned to make a game for Mastertronic based on, of all things, real tennis. You know, the very posh sport that's mostly played by the gentry and royals. This plan fell through when Mastertronic completely changed their mind, but the Bitmaps decided to roll with it, switching up the game completely, throwing the real tennis stuff in the bin, and literally writing the ideas for Speedball down on the back of a packet of silk cut in the pub. The end result was a top-down future sports game, one of the first of its kind, featuring a violent mixture of handball and ice hockey, where players grab the ball out of the sky, bash the hell out of each other, and try to get the ball into the opposing goal. Points are scored either through goals or injuring the other team, and there's a bunch of power-ups that can help you out in these quick-fire tussles. It's certainly a big switch from real tennis to this rollerball-esque piece, although actually, the Bitmaps didn't see rollerball until after the game was released and everyone started talking about the connection. The regular Speedball is, again, not a game that has aged too well, but it's still pretty fun to play simply because the action is so fast and furious, and yet there is a certain strategy to what's going on. Unlike a lot of Bitmap Brothers games, the original Speedball can be a bit easy. So long as you can get your players into a certain position, it seems like you can score 8 to 9 times out of 10. Of course, getting there is the trouble. It's alright, a very good, solidly 16-bit affair. And technically this received an 8-bit port too. In 1991 the game was released on the NES as Clash Ball. A half-decent game, albeit one that is kind of eclipsed by its sequel. Speaking of sequels, the Bitmaps released their biggest game to date in 1989, Xenon 2 Mega Blast, one of the biggest Amiga games of what was one of the computer's banner years. Named after the song by Bomb Bass that features in the game itself, Xenon 2 Mega Blast has the honour of being the first game to feature a largely accurate rendition of a commercial pop song in the soundtrack. Short of a couple of samples, the title music is the same as the pop song. The game itself is even simpler than Xenon. The morphing ship is gone, and instead you've got a straight-ahead space shooter with these odd little fungal surroundings. Xenon 2 is definitely a lot better than the original, although again it does show its age. The difficulty level is legendary. A lot of European shoot-em-ups are hard, and this is one of the very toughest of the lot. Even the shop halfway through, ran by the Predator of all people, will barely help you. It's a very tough game, and sometimes the controls can be a bit irritating. It's not bad at all though, it deserved the success that it got in 1989, that's for damn sure. Xenon 2 also has the dubious honour of being arguably the worst shoot-em-up on the Mega Drive. It received an utterly botched port in late 1991 which lost the almighty soundtrack almost entirely, ran much slower than the Amiga version, and cut out an entire level. How this port came to be so horrific? I don't know. After this bout of arcade action, the Bitmaps gave us something very different. 1990's Cadaver was their most complex game to date. This is a very tough adventure-type game. It feels like an evolution from the classic old specky isometric games like Nightlaw and what have you, with much more in the way of things to do. I find this game to be kind of hard to pick up, but once you know what you're doing, it can be really engrossing. There's a few different ways to solve the puzzles on offer, and there's a lot of tricks and traps to keep you on your toes. I'm no good at this game, but it's recognisably very good and still lovely looking. It rightly got fantastic reviews. If you like the old isometric games or stuff like Landstalker and Equinox, this game's for you too. Cadaver was followed by an expansion pack, The Payoff, which was released in the following year. The Bitmaps' first 4 games were all pretty good, certainly for the time, but true greatness would wait until their 5th game, 1990's Speedball-Brutal Deluxe. I have spoken extensively about this game before, but it is the definition of exactly what a sequel should be. Everything that was good about the original is here, only improved by a factor of 10. Brutal Deluxe is the greatest and most exhilarating future sports game of them all. Everything feels so much better, the impact of the blows is shocking, there's not so many cheap goals, the arena has a load more features. It's almost perfect. Literally, the only things that are wrong with this game is that you wish the league season would wrap over instead of there just being 2 years worth of play. Speedball 2 is one of the Amiga's greatest games, and it showed just how good a game the Bitmaps could make. What an incredible title. One of those games that just flat out speaks for itself. Speedball 2 would be the last game that the Bitmaps would release for Imageworks, seeing as they were already a games developer with a strong image and every game they'd released so far had been a hit. The relationship between the Imageworks and the Bitmaps was kind of fractious at times, mainly because Bitmap did not like working with other publishers. The original trifecta now had a few more additions. Mark Coleman and Dan Malone, graphic devs extraordinaire, people like Ed Bartlett, Jamie Barber and John Phillips also joined the group, and there were frequent collaborators and links with other companies. In particular, a strong link between the Bitmaps and another small group who'd formed around the same time and made splashes of their own, Sensible Software. Ultimately, the Bitmaps were too big to simply be a developer working for another publisher, they were never particularly comfortable taking orders from publishers at all, and thus the relationship with Imageworks ended. This, in one way, proved to be quite timely. The Imageworks story ended in spectacularly devastating fashion in the months following late 1991, when Robert Maxwell fell off a yacht. However, one upshot of this was that because of the destruction of Mirrorsoft and the Maxwell Empire, the Bitmaps received barely any royalties for Speedball 2, which was a huge blow for them at the time. Anyway, the Bitmaps decided to do it all themselves and created their own publishing imprint, Renegade Software. This was quite a different move for the time. Self-publishing was pretty common back in the early 80s, but the practice had faded somewhat as the budget for making games had increased and publishers had become more high-profile. Indeed, it was fairly common for devs to sign up with multiple publishers at this point. It was a sign of intent on part of the Bitmaps, and certainly a flash of bravado that showed their intention to bring themselves and computer gaming to the forefront on the Amiga. The Renegade label was mainly used for their games, but it would publish games by a few others. Much like the Bitmaps themselves, they didn't publish much, but what they did publish was all pretty damn quality. I mean, let's just look at Renegade's releases, starting with the biggest of them all. The Bitmap Brothers and Sensible Software relationship was largely based on Mike Montgomery's friendly, at least most of the time, rivalry and friendship with Sensi co-founder John Hare. The Essex-born ponytailed balladeer extraordinaire and Montgomery have worked together quite a lot in the years since, but it all started with 2 young teams, both of whom wanted to be visible developers and take away attention from the publishers, having a good battle with the other. At one point, the Bitmaps were referred to as the Bitmap Wankers in Sensi's company phone book. Still, they'd ultimately come together with Renegade publishing the original Sensible Soccer. It's worth mentioning that Sensible also had a deal with Mirrorsoft for Megalomania, which would have in the future included Sensible Soccer and Cannon Fodder in the bargain. So yeah, they got pretty screwed by the Maxwell Empire's collapse too. Again, Sensible Soccer isn't a game I need to write a hell of a lot about. I can refer you to the 4-part video series I did on the Sensi games. But yeah, it's pretty good. In fact, it's pretty much the greatest football game of them all. Just the right speed mixed with endless playability, a game that is addictive to a ridiculous degree, and one of the best multiplayer games of all time. Sensi would become one of the Amiga's most popular titles, if not its most popular title full stop. From its original release, Sensi and its various incarnations would almost always be at or near the top of the charts. And Renegade's involvement didn't stop with the original. The label published all Amiga Sensi games, from the original through to SWOS and its final incarnation, Sensible World of Soccer 96-97. Another developer who had a good relationship with Renegade was Andrew Braybrook and Steve Turner's almighty Graft Gold. Arguably one of the greatest devs of the 8-bit micro era, these legends had struggled a fair bit thanks to the end of relationships with Hewson and, in particular, Activision, but were helped along in the 16-bit era by both Virgin on the consoles and, in particular, Renegade on computers. Renegade published 3 superb games by Graft Gold, all of which had initially been promised to Mirrorsoft before, again, the whole Maxwell Yacht Death pension fraud thing. Can you see something of a pattern emerging here? The first of these was Fire and Ice, a slippy and slidey platformer featuring a very cute hero where you collect bits of a key in order to progress. It looks really nice, as Graft Gold games often do, and isn't a bad player. For me, this is one of the better Amiga platformers. Sadly never came out for the Mega Drive as was planned, but an 8-bit version did arrive. In particular, a Master System version that only ever saw release in Brazil. Uridium 2, a sequel to the seminal 8-bit shooter, came out for the Amiga only in 1993. The core gameplay is much the same. You fly over the top of an enemy base, you can go left and right destroying things, and you have to get through a few waves of enemies before getting the call to land. A boss has been added now though, which gets you inside of the ship. It's okay, but it does lack the original's immediacy a bit for me. The best Graft Gold Renegade release for me though is the almighty Viro Cop, a game which is connected to the earlier Quasitron. This is a brilliantly made and thoroughly creative little shooter with design that just puts a smile on your face, and it plays great too. This is a fantastic game. It's a shame that it's not very well known, probably because it only ever came out for the Amiga, and in 1995 at that, by which time the system was really fading out, but it's highly recommended by me. There's a few more games here too. One of the highest profile ones being Factor 5's Turrican 3 for the Amiga, which was published by Renegade in most of Europe, barring Germany. Doesn't need much introduction. It's Turrican, outstanding action, and one of the best soundtracks ever courtesy of Chris Hulsbeck. Number 3 is more straight ahead than most Turricans, but still very good indeed. Then there's Elfmania, an odd Japanese-ish fighting game by Terramark. These guys are better known as Housemarque, a Finnish developer who make the Stardust games and are still very much around today. It's okay as far as these things go. It kinda plays like Yaya Kung Fu more than any contemporary fighter. Not bad, but not a patch on Shadow Fighter. And how about 1994's Rough and Tumble? Like Viro Cop, this is another excellent and very late Amiga game, a fabulous run and gunner, almost like what Metal Slug would be if it were an Amiga game. Awesome. The game was made by Wunderkind, a British developer who only ever released this one game. Finally, Renegade published Interactive Binary's Flight of the Amazon Queen, which is a fairly fun point-and-clicker in the LucasArts mould. Not bad, and some great characters and all that, but people do kinda regard the puzzles as somewhat annoying. Still, it's definitely a cult title. So those are all of the non-Bitmap Brother Renegade software games pretty much. There's still a couple more for PlayStation. And damn, while there's not a lot of them, it's a pretty fearsome lineup. Even the lesser releases here are quality, and the best of them are all-time classics. If you're publishing the likes of every classic sensible soccer game, Viro Cop, Turrican 3, and Rough and Tumble, you're definitely doing something right. They certainly weren't releasing any old gubbins. And they did well by developers too. The profits for all games on the Renegade label were shared 50-50 between Renegade and the developer. Not the most profitable way of doing things, certainly not something that a lot of publishers would have done, but it was fair. But of course Renegade was also used as a label for the main event, the Bitmap Brothers. There's 4 more of those games to look at now under the Renegade label, so let's do it and jump right back to 1991. Gods might actually be the first Bitmaps title that I was aware of. The magazine pictures of it made it look particularly incredible. And as the first Bitmaps title to be published on the Renegade label, it kinda had to be something pretty special. And yeah, it certainly shifted some units. You play as someone who's looking to join the pantheon of the gods, and has to defeat several guardians in order to get there. And of course get through several levels of ancient Greek-style platforming and puzzling action. Gods, as it turns out, has mostly held up pretty well. Unlike, say, Zenon, the platforming here is still quite strong, as are the looks and all that. And of course, the difficulty is again massive. It will not take much at all for this game to kill you outright if you put a foot one. These days I kind of feel it's better if you use a trainer and enable infinite lives. I have a lot more fun that way. At one point in more modern times, this game seemed to be dredged up quite often and thought of as an old school Dark Souls. I do get that, sort of, at least in terms of difficulty, risk and reward, that sort of thing. The game got a spectacular reception though, and was ported most everywhere at the time. Definitely one of the Bitmaps' bigger hits. It's still worth playing, but prepare yourself for punishment. As with Xenon 2, Gods used an established artist for the game's soundtrack. John Fox, under his Nation 12 alter ego, provided the memorable theme music to the game. Magic Pockets, the second Bitmap Renegade release, was another hit. Like Zenon, this was thanks to its appearance as a phone game on a kids show, this time the ITV show Motormouth, where folks would shout things like jump and zap into their phone to control a game. In keeping with tradition, there was more commercial music, this time an instrumental version of Betty Boop's Doin' the Do. You play as a cool dude known as the Bitmap Kid, who beats enemies by trapping them with his massive pockets that he can chuck around willy-nilly. It seems like people do remember this one a fair bit, but honestly, I've never liked it that much. It always feels kind of drab to me, and the pocket gimmick is kinda silly. Not the Bitmap's best, I feel. There was a little gap between Magic Pockets and the next title, during which time the Bitmaps worked on a couple of titles that never saw the light of day, in particular a futuristic racing title that's known variously as Bike, Havoc, or Triple X. A third speedball game was also in the works for a brief period. In the end, however, all of these fell by the wayside. Indeed, almost 2 years passed from Magic Pockets to the next Bitmaps game, and hoo boy was it worth waiting for. Again, I've already covered the Chaos Engine pretty extensively in the past, a steampunk, gauntlet-esque action title where you pick 2 hard-nailed hired guns for a mission to destroy the titular machine and save the world from out-of-control monsters. This game is, quite simply, amazing. Inspiring. The action is first-rate, the soundtrack is a brutal smash of hammering wavy goodness, there's all those voice samples, and every level is great. I don't really need to say that it's difficult, I mean, it's a Bitmaps game, but it's hard in a way that's more rewarding than just about any other Bitmaps title. One of those games you can lose yourself in, something that always springs to my mind. It's brilliant, one of the truly great Amiga titles. It's also pretty great on the Mega Drive and SNES too as it goes, although it was inexplicably renamed Soldiers of Fortune in the US. Phenomenal. For a lot of people, the Chaos Engine was the Bitmap's greatest achievement to date. Even by their high standards, they'd surpassed themselves with this one. If any game could be picked as evidence in 1993 to show that the Amiga was still an ongoing concern, it was probably this one. Naturally, a sequel was going to be hyped pretty damn hard, and when it was announced in 1994, the magazines went crazy over it. Set for release in the summer of '95, the early months were filled with hype for the Chaos Engine sequel, which promised to deliver even more of the original's brilliance. The Bitmaps were certainly talking it up big, of that there's no doubt, and they had a lot to say. Amiga Magazine Le One not only ran a cover feature on the game, but a series of 4 in-depth previews in the months after. Even Amiga Power got on the train somewhat. And yet neither Le One nor Amiga Power would live long enough to see the Chaos Engine 2 finally get released. What exactly happened with the Chaos Engine 2 then? It's a little tricky to say. A lot of things really. The original game itself was quite expensive to make, and there were a lot of issues with the engine to sort out, in particular for the game to function in the way that the Bitmaps wanted it to. In the main though, Chaos 2 was a casualty of the transition from Amiga to PC, with the studio working on their first proper PC game, Zedd, at the same time. The Bitmaps were still a fairly small group and resources were finite, and so Chaos 2 suffered hugely. Console versions of the game were prototyped but soon cancelled, and the game kinda slipped into development hell, delay after delay after delay. From a proposed summer '95 release, the game slipped all the way to late 1996. It went from a glorious Amiga send-off to, ultimately, barely even an afterthought. Barely anyone was playing games on Amiga in late '96, and so Chaos 2 came out to barely any reception. And in the end, it's kind of disappointing. The big idea for Chaos 2 was to change the game from a cooperative experience to a head-to-head spy versus spy-esque one, where you now compete with your fellow mercenary to complete levels, get money, and otherwise engage in combat. In patches it works, but it's kind of clunky, and a far cry from the original experience. It doesn't help that the game kind of feels unfinished. The levels are so basic and bland, and even 2 of the original cast have been dropped from it. The flair of the original just isn't there, and it feels like it was just put out in order to stop everyone from complaining. A very disappointing end to the Bitmaps' glorious Amiga years, and the way too late arrival is only one reason for that. In the end, it's just not that good a game. The Chaos Engine 2 is the worst Bitmaps title we've looked at up to this point, a real shame all things considered. Mike Montgomery has said that he kind of regretted releasing the game in the end, and feels that in the end it should have been canned. With the Amiga market so small at that point, it only sold around 4,000 copies, and thousands of extra copies were basically thrown out. Still, it was time to look to the future, and as small as the Bitmaps were, they were determined to survive the transition from 2D to 3D. Their first gambit would be, again, something new for them, a real-time strategy game. The transition to the 3D years was tough on a lot of developers. Suddenly, the costs of game making went way higher. If you could, then hiring more people was necessary. Also, failure was quite simply not an option. If a project failed in the 16-bit days, then it was often painful but survivable. A failed project now, though, could easily sink you. Many of the Amiga folk didn't survive. Graft Gold is sadly a good example. While they developed a couple of PlayStation games under Renegade, International Motor X and a version of Rainbow Islands, previously a classic port for the Spectrum, it wasn't enough, and after being bought by Time Warner in 1996, they folded completely in 1998. Sensible Software, arguably the kins of the Amiga, were an even more brutal example. The failure to convert the ambitious and very expensive Sex and Drugs and Rock and Roll into a game all but killed them, and 3D updates to Sensible Soccer just didn't work out sales-wise. In 1999, the company was sold to Codemasters and folded. Another casualty, as it goes, was the Bitmaps publishing label. In 1996, Renegade Software was sold to Time Warner Interactive. As much as it was a good thing to self-publish, by this point it was too expensive for the Bitmaps to do. Ultimately, when Time Warner Interactive was sold to GT, the Renegade label was dropped completely. The Bitmaps would go back to just being independent developers once more, and decided to go for PC development. Their first proper 32-bit generation game would be published by Virgin Interactive. Fortunately, it's one that a lot of you probably know. Zedd was one of the Bitmaps' biggest and most expensive projects, around about £2 million I think. The game was originally destined for the Amiga, and there were even working versions of the game made for it, but ultimately it was one of those games that just grew and grew and went to the PC. Mike Montgomery has said that in total, the game took around 4.5 years to make from original idea to release. Most of this was down to the cutscenes, which were necessitated by the move from floppy disks to CDs, and the publisher's requirement to fill up 680 megs of disk space compared to the single floppy that the game was designed for. Zedd was a popular RTS back in the day, a game set in a robotic world where you play as 2 grunts named Alan and Brad on a delivery mission for the almighty cigar-chomping leader General Zod. Suddenly this mission involves fighting enemy soldiers and taking over planets, as it does. The game's certainly very personable, funny cutscenes, lots of speech and so on. It was regarded back in the day as a somewhat more irreverent Command & Conquer, which we'll get back to, only with the difficulty severely jacked up, very challenging AI for the time. Now, as you can probably tell, RTS games are my weak spot. I just don't understand them. As far as RTSs go, I know this is well regarded, and it seems like it would be definitely fun if I understood the genre. So I can give it a pass, although really my opinion on RTSs is not one to be followed. There are various ways to play it. This is the PlayStation version of the original, which was ported by Chrysalis. It's fine as far as console RTSs go, although the original PC version is assuredly better. There is a port on Steam, but apparently it's of a mobile version and not very good. But there is also an open source Zod engine remake that is apparently fine and focuses on multiplayer. Zedd would prove to be a pretty strong title for the Bitmaps, and not a bad entry into the new generation. Aside from America, it was a big success just about everywhere in the West, and especially in Russia, and one of the Bitmaps' biggest selling titles. But still, cash remained tight as the American market gradually took a stranglehold on the gaming business. There was also quiet movements against them, such as Zedd's lead programmer being snapped up by Westwood Studios, who would immediately deploy him on the upcoming Command & Conquer, along with a bunch of stuff from Zedd that he'd taken with him. The first Zedd was, as it happens, the Bitmaps' last game for 4 years. Indeed, it could even be considered in some ways as the final truly major Bitmaps title. What happened in those 4 years? Well, as far as Zedd goes, the sequel to it took a long time, in particular because the Bitmaps transitioned from 2D to 3D for it. That and the publishers, now GT Interactive, seemed to be clicking their heels when it came to a sequel. Things kinda went pretty quiet, and in the end there was only Montgomery left as far as the big boys went. At least until 2000, when the Bitmaps name would resurface again, this time for an older game. It surely made perfect sense of all the classic old Bitmaps games to revive Speedball. The game's brand of highly kinetic and accessible fun would be a no-brainer on a PlayStation that was already kind of used to chrome-tastic futuristic efforts. And hell, considering that the Bitmaps had previously made virtually no money from what was probably their most popular game, you can kinda see why they would go back to Speedball. And so, in late 2000, the original came back in 3D form, Speedball 2100. And it was a kinda mixed deal. The thing about Speedball 2100 isn't that it's bad, it's actually not, far from it. I was a lot harsher on it back when I reviewed the Speedball series as a whole, but the game is basically Speedball 2 in 3D. It's very faithful to the original, with the same arena, same teams, same general structure, same ice cream. Short of the 3D graphics, there's no wild changes here, except you can play as other teams aside from Brutal Deluxe in some modes. And the gameplay is still the same, only now you have a button for shooting and tackling, and one for jumping. It's Speedball 2, and that's hardly a bad thing. Still the same good multiplayer action, plus exciting matches with the computer. I guess that it just lacks a little something. The 3D graphics don't really match up with the 2D ones. It's just missing that little bit of pace. The game is pretty okay though. If you like Speedball, then this is perfectly good. Not a bad modernisation considering the high standards it had to live up to, and I think it's better than the faster but more gimmicky Dead Ball Zone. It's just that Speedball tends to work better in 2D, and alas, this game wasn't a particularly big seller unfortunately. As the Bitmaps output does get thinner, it's worth mentioning that they did a little something for the Games Magazine PC format called Zenon 2000 in 2000. Basically, it's a reimagining of Zenon 2, consisting of just the first level. It's okay, kinda slow. I've never been a Zenon fan, but the game's kinda missing the intensity and the wavy soundtrack, so it feels a bit more generic in many ways. All that said, considering that it's a free game on a demo CD, it's not bad. Sort of feels like something that was planned to be a full game but never got finished, and so this is where it ended up. As for the next major Bitmaps game, that would be the 3D sequel to the original Zedd. In 2001 we finally got to see Zedd Steel Soldiers. The original Zedd is considered a fairly influential game in RTS circles. Some consider it to be the beginning of more concentrated and small group-oriented strategy games, the likes of Company of Heroes and what have you. The same can't really be said for Steel Soldiers, which in many ways has been lost to time. As it is, I wasn't able to get the original to work, but as with the original Zedd, a remake is available on Steam, so we'll have to use that. It's not been received well, and I'm not sure if it's the same game that people played back in the day really. It feels kind of simple. Now I'm still useless at RTSs, so any nuances here kind of pass me by, but it doesn't feel like a complex game. Sadly, the general opinion of the game at the time seemed to be that it wasn't bad, but it felt kind of dated in 2001. In 2003, the same engine was used for a game called World War II Frontline Command, which sadly I haven't been able to find. Which is a bit of a shame considering that it is the last proper Bitmap Brothers game. So how did the Bitmap story end? There wasn't really anything spectacular about it. As they were always independent, they weren't at the mercy of a bigger company who was owning them or anything like that, nor did they sell the name out. In the end though, doing things in the Bitmap way became less and less viable. Working with other publishers always seemed to go south for them. They'd work on something, it'd be out or nearly ready, or it'd be out and successful, and then the publisher goes bust and the Bitmaps end up not getting any money. Shit like that. It just gets kind of wearying. And so the Bitmaps just kinda went their separate ways really. Not that they all left the business or anything like that. Mike Montgomery would work with John Hare for a couple of years on a company called Tower Studios that specialised in mobile games. Things went fine until, again, publishers started trying to screw them over. He spent various times chilling in contract programming, while also running the odd company here and there, such as one that specialised in green screen filming and video for games on the likes of the Wii and 360 Connect. The other main Bitmaps, Steve Kelly and Eric Matthews, decided to leave the board in 1998 and also concentrate on programming. For all the core Bitmaps, it seems that programming is certainly the thing they love most of all, certainly more than management, and that's reflected in their choices and their style. The Bitmap Brothers still do exist in a way, at the very least as an imprint, which has been used at various times to keep the name of some of the old Bitmap games alive, although the original Bitmaps are no longer involved. In particular, Speedball, which has seen multiple 3D versions over the years, all of varying quality. There's the Evolution version by Kiloton, Speedball 2 Tournament, an Xbox Live Arcade one that you can't download anymore. Honestly, 2100 is still amongst the best of them. Speedball 2 HD, which can be downloaded on Steam, isn't too bad at all, mind you. A good way to play Speedball on the cheap. The Chaos engine was also re-released on Steam a couple of years ago. While it's not been changed much at all, it's not bad if you don't have any other way of legitimately playing the Chaos engine. And of course, we've already mentioned Zedd. Whether we'll see any of the other Bitmap games refashioned in some way kinda remains to be seen. It would be nice to perhaps see the likes of Gods, or even Cadaver, one of Montgomery's personal favourites of the games he had a hand in, brought back to life in one form or another, but any movement on that front is pretty quiet. The most recent big Bitmaps related project was indeed a book, Universe, released by Read Only Memory, which documents the story of the company in the words of the people who were there. Once again, Montgomery's decision to go ahead with the book was inspired by his glorious rivalry with John Hare after he'd done the same. Montgomery is definitely the most visible ex-Bitmap, although others can certainly be found kicking around the industry. And so that's the story and games of the Bitmap Brothers. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. It's certainly been one that's requested a hell of a lot. The funny thing about it is that I've already done a lot of Bitmap stuff, from series like Speedball and the Chaos Engine, to related games like Turrican 3 and Sensible Soccer. I wondered if I wouldn't just be going through old ground with this one, but hopefully there was enough interesting info here to make it worthwhile. They're certainly a forthright and awesome developer, fiercely independent, never afraid to tell publishers to get stuffed, and they made games that were undoubtedly their own. An example to live by, without a doubt. Bye for now.
Set me free. The chaos has ended. You will be remembered.
In this video, I would like to thank the following: Adam Schaefer, Andrew Dalton, Andy Catt, Audie Sawley, Carly, Conformist, Daniel David Taylor, Dustin Cooper, Gary Pinkett, George Newton, Ghostly Spectre, Gray from Blackpool, James Idd, James Loveridge, Jason Durso, Jason Goy, Jason Leach, Jason Stevens, Johan Eriksson, Josh Jensen, Elle O'Brien, Lee Norris, ManagerSim.net, Mark Heslop, Mark Johnston, Mark Whittington, Martin Pataki, Nanette McCrone, Olaf Albeen, Pete Morris, Peter Jack, Peter Sidorn, Phil Tabrog, Rachel Maxwell, Romeo, Ryan Wyatt Coleman, Sammy Lee, Seth Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Taylor Armand, The Unnatural, Tanyo J, Twisted Scroat, Bishar D, Yurka Operator, and Zach Roach.